Great. Excellent to see so many people. I think we have quite a few global attendees from around the world, Nicaragua, from Mexico, Valerie and Adelia. Excellent. Welcome, everybody. And I think we will get started. So please do continue introducing yourselves in the chat. And we will have time at the end of the discussion today for some questions from the audience. So we'll invite you to ask questions in the Q&A chat form as they come up. You don't need to wait to the end. We'll be compiling the questions throughout the conversations, and we'll have a chance to see the questions at the end. So I think we will get started. What a great group. We've got quite a few people joining. This is excellent. So good afternoon. Buenos dias. Bonjour. Welcome, everyone. My name is Crystal Tremblay. I'm a faculty member with the Department of Geography at the University of Victoria, and I'm the director of CFAL Victoria, which is a new initiative. Here at the University of Victoria, it's part of the United Nations Institute for Training and Research, part of the global CFAL network, which is working to build leadership and capacity to address and support the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I would like to begin today by acknowledging the traditional territories of the First Nations, Inuit and Métis across Turtle Island, where each of us reside, and of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples, the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wassanish First Nations, where I am privileged to live and work and where I'm residing today. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional territories of Indigenous peoples around the world, their right to self-determination and sovereignty, and the relationships to all aspects of creation since time immemorial. I acknowledge the diversity of Indigenous nations, territories, and communities, and each of their unique relationships to lands and water. Before I introduce the panelists and begin our session today, I would like to invite Anne-Catherine Béjar, the Executive Director of the British Columbia Council for International Cooperation, to welcome us and to say a few words. Welcome, Anne-Cat.
Yes, hi, my name is Anne-Catherine Béjar, and CATS is how I'm known. I am currently the Executive Director of the BC Council for International Cooperation, but I would say all my life an activist, and we all have different roles at different times. Right now, I'm pleased to and very privileged to actually lead or support the Coalition of International Cooperation Organizations of BC. We represent 28 organizational members across the province, over 100 individual members, and we have about 3,000 participants per year. We also have 6 branches in different areas of the province, plus, or within that, there's one branch that's actually on climate justice specifically. International Development Week is a week that's a bit of the highlight of the year, but we do this work all around the year long. So right now we have several events, which Brianne will probably tell you more about at the end. And this is our first event that we're really pleased to have with Pilar, Peggy, Natalia, Crystal as facilitator. For us, what's important is to look and deep into the intersection of women's leadership, peace, climate action, food sovereignty. The idea, and not just the idea, the reality that we have seen is that we all need to have a greater attunement to women's rights, gender equality, peace and security in every other part of the topics or issues that we need to work on for a more equitable world and healthy planets. So whether it's about wars happening in Ukraine, Afghanistan, Yemen, military spending, nuclear threats, or the area specifically of climate action, Indigenous rights, food sovereignty, education, and youth involvement, it cannot work without the intersection among themselves and throughout the role of women, gender equity, and identity also, not just women, men, but not just the binary, but the recognition of people's roles within society. So the topic of today, and with our esteemed panelists, it's fresh food, distressed planet, food, climate crisis, peace, and women's leadership. So you've read that, of course, but why? I think it's encapsulated very well by what the United Nations World Food Programme Assistant Executive Director or Deputy Executive Director, Valérie Guarnieri, said Women are the bedrock of food security and yet are hardest hit by climate shocks and food insecurity. So that places women not as a victim of climate problems, of the downfalls of war or of climate. It also places them as the leaders in choosing where and how we can better govern our nation, our country, our states. I do want to acknowledge, before passing the role or the work back on to our facilitator, that we are all living on or near or within Indigenous territories. In Canada right now, I'm on the territory of the Musqueam people, for example, in Turtle Island. But the reality of Indigenous peoples is worldwide, in South America and Western Africa. And to me, the most important, apart from the acknowledgement here in Canada, is to recognize the colonization that continues to be implemented by our global state system, by individual countries, by one country over another, and by one person over another. So to me, it's important to say that I've also lived and worked in the lands of Guarani, Chicano, Guarayos in Bolivia. In another country, in Liberia, it was 14 different, they call themselves ethnic populations, not Indigenous peoples. It's their designation for themselves. But I always look at the role of international cooperation in not recognizing, too often, not recognizing the diversity and the reality of Indigenous peoples in the countries that we tend to have links of partnership and cooperation with. So I guess that's my word on acknowledging where we are, is also the role of international cooperation, too often being a colonizing force or being perceived as one. We need to go beyond decolonization. We need to include reparation, and we need to stop any further colonizing actions. That said, before I leave you and start the conversations, I do want to propose that if you are interested in what is happening, at least in Canada, with Indigenous women, we have at least 3 national associations: the Native Women's Association of Canada, the Pakwiti Inuit Women of Canada, and the Métis Women of Canada. So we'll send you the links later on if you're interested in studying what they have to say. And over to you, Crystal, I believe. Thank you and welcome everybody.
Thank you, NCAV. And I just as a preface to our discussion today, and as we will hear from each of our speakers, I just want to also emphasize the critical role that women play in food security, climate justice, and peace. In many countries around the world, women are responsible for growing and preparing food for their families and communities, and have specific knowledge about how to steward the land, water, and resources. Women also face several challenges by not having access to land, credit, and other resources that would otherwise support them in their efforts towards food security and production. As a result of these barriers, they are disproportionately affected by food insecurity and the growing climate crisis. Women are often on the front lines of climate change, including droughts, floods, fires, rising sea levels, which disproportionately impact them due to their role in agriculture and their lack of access to resources and or decision-making power. Women are also play important roles as peacekeepers in families and communities. They are often leading civil society organizations, as we'll see here today from our speakers, mobilizing peace-building efforts. They are often the first to be affected by conflicts and the last to be included in peace negotiations. Women's contributions to food justice, climate adaptation, resiliency, and peace are often overlooked and undervalued, and more efforts need to be made to ensure their voices and lived experiences are heard and their rights respected. I'm so pleased to introduce our speakers today and grateful for their contributions in these important conversations. Pilar Garcia is a country representative for Peru with CUSO International, bringing over 16 years of experience in international development programs and interaction with local and multinational stakeholders. Her capacities are with large projects, human resources, and volunteer management, in which she has developed partnerships and led programs on gender equality, economic opportunities for women and youth, sexual and reproductive health. Welcome, Pilar. Peggy Edwards is a consultant, policy analyst, and writer specializing in issues related to aging, social justice, voluntarism, and gender, and an activist for the rights of older people. Peggy is co-founder of the Grandmothers Advocacy Network, GRAN, whose mission is to advocate for the human rights of older women, children, and youth, and gender diverse persons, both globally and locally. Welcome, Peggy. And Natalia Marisco-Tiver, hopefully I got that right, is a Guatemalan psychologist and holds a Master in Science in Social and Cultural Psychology from the London School of Economics and Political Science. Natalia is a gender justice lead for Oxfam Central America, focused on reducing gender inequality in Central America, working closely with women's and LGBTQ organizations in addressing root causes of inequality, promoting women's leadership, and influencing public policies, including at the intersections of migration, food security, and the prevention of violence against women and girls. Welcome, Natalia. So as again, just a reminder for those that do have questions that come up, because there'll be some excellent conversations here today, do please write your questions in the chat. So I wanted to maybe start the first question for all of you as an opportunity to just introduce yourselves a little bit more and your organizations and the work that you've been doing. So I'll start with Pilar and then Peggy and Natalia. So we're here to explore women's leadership, climate action, food security, and peace. We'd love to hear from each of you a bit more, again, about yourselves and your organization as it relates specifically to these topics. So I'll start with Pilar.
Thank you, Crystal. Thank you all for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here with such a great group of women. My name is Pilar Garcia, as you mentioned. Before, I'm the country representative of CUSO International in Peru since October 2018, but I have been with the organization for the past 10 years. I'm Nicaraguan, and I have experience working in international development, and I call myself proudly an international development worker. My experience includes, as you mentioned, gender equality projects, and in CUSO International, we are in a very interesting moment right now because we just finished the process of the new strategic plan that includes 3 priorities, being them gender equality, economic resiliency, and advancing in climate action. So currently, as a country representative in Peru, I'm very honored to lead 2 interesting projects that are focused on women. The first one is Women's Voice and Leadership, and the second one, of which I will speak more today, is MUSA, is Women United for Environmental and Food Security. And I will speak more about this project. We also have another project called Empleos para Construir Futuros, or SCOP in English, that focuses on socioeconomic integration of Venezuelan migrants and refugees in Peru. And let me tell you that CUSO has been around in Peru for more than 50 years. Actually, CUSO was started in Peru in 1969. And the organization as a whole is a global organization. We are in 16 countries around Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean. And we have a good number of interesting projects that promote the participation of women, gender equality, and also food security, economic integration. So it is a very interesting organization. It is a Canadian organization. And I want to thank well, first, our main donor, the government of Canada, but also the private people that contributes with the implementation of our projects. Thank you.
Thank you, Pilar. And I'll invite Peggy.
Yes, thank you very much. What an esteemed person to follow. I would just like to say, first of all, to add to the discussion about Indigenous peoples, I'm tuning in from Victoria, but my home is in Ottawa on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people. But I want to particularly acknowledge the role that Indigenous elders play as knowledge keepers and sharers when it comes to climate change and food sovereignty, and to suggest that we need to listen to them more as we struggle with these issues, both in Canada and around the world. I am 75 years old, and I'm a grandmother and great-grandmother of 18 in all. So I'm a great believer in the power and importance of intergenerational solidarity in addressing the issues we're going to talk about today. As was mentioned today, I'm representing the Grandmothers Advocacy Network. So great in the chat box to see so many of you here. We are a voluntary network of grandmothers, older women, and what we call grand others. In other words, you don't need to be a biological grandmother to join us. We work in Canada and with international organizations to promote and protect the human rights of grandmothers, older women, and gender diverse peoples, and children and youth in the global South, but especially in Sub-Saharan Africa. Very often, the courageous older women there are raising millions of young people orphaned by AIDS. Our current advocacy campaign, which we're just starting, is called The Right to Food. This is an advocacy campaign calling for an end to hunger, food insecurity, and malnutrition, especially in Sub-Saharan Africa, where countries face the greatest hunger challenges, and among grandmothers and their families, who are the most vulnerable, yet remain largely invisible on the global and political agenda. So looking forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peggy. And I'll invite our third speaker, Natalia.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And it's really great to be able to share this space with other amazing women that are doing great work in the region. My name is Natalia. I am a social psychologist and also an LGBTIQ rights activist based in Guatemala. And I am currently representing Oxfam Central America as the gender justice lead for our program in this region. In Oxfam Central America, we are interested in having an intersectional approach to end inequality in its various forms. And we currently work in different areas, including gender justice, providing humanitarian assistance and creating resilient practices in the region to prevent and respond to humanitarian crises. We also work in issues regarding tax justice, tax redistribution, and social protection. And we are seeking to have a feminist approach in all of our practices, understanding how gender intersects with the different aspects and factors of inequality. Our gender program specifically works with civil society organizations and women's rights movements and LGBTIQ rights organizations in topics including sexual and reproductive rights, gender-based violence prevention and attention, women's economic empowerment, and also how these organizations can influence decision-making positions and policies in order to ensure gender equality and women's rights in these different countries and in the region. Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Natalia. I think we'll start our first question with you, actually, Natalia, to continue learning a bit more about your work in Central America and the communities that you're working very closely with. If you could just give us a sense of how the climate crisis has been affecting food insecurity in this region. What are some of the experiences that different people are facing, and any personal experiences that you can share with us on this?
Yes, absolutely. I think it's very important that when we talk about, and you mentioned it a little earlier, of how there are many intersections that come into play when we discuss food insecurity, and we cannot discuss food insecurity without talking about gender, climate change, migration, inequality, and neo-colonial practices from international industries. So I think it's very important to emphasize how these things come into play. And this is true for many different regions around the world, but I'm going to focus in the Central America region. And I think an important example of how this comes into play is the dry corridor in our region, which is a region that goes from the south of Mexico to the north of Costa Rica, that is particularly impacted by climate change, particularly impacted by poverty and economic inequality. And the people that are most impacted in this region are, of course, women. To summarize a little bit, and let me know if I'm going a bit off trail, because there's a lot to talk about in this topic. Women are the most vulnerable to issues related to food insecurity and to climate change, usually related to lack of land ownership, and policies that provide technical assistance to agricultural practices are usually not targeted towards women or very deficient in towards the gender approaches. So lack of access to land combined with lack of policies in place to support women particularly impacted by climate change and loss in agriculture and crops lead to women having less access to land and therefore more food insecurity. And this in turn also increases gender-based violence in the region, making women particularly vulnerable to different forms of violence, both domestic and outside their homes, due to this intersecting inequalities. So our current programs focus on different levels of these issues, including helping promote the access to land and to resources for women to be able to secure their own sustenance, but also to be able to grow crops or participate in agricultural activities for economic gain as well, and to promote resilient practices that help women face the consequences of climate change, but also supporting local organizations in influencing local governments and national governments into having better policies that help with these resilient practices to face climate change, but also have a better gender approach to issues such as land ownership. So these are some of the practices and programs that we are implementing in the region to help organizations, communities, and women address these structural issues.
Thank you, Natalia. These challenges that you're sharing with us are certainly felt in other parts of the world, and as we'll hear more from Pilar and Peggy. Maybe I'll turn next to Peggy to share a little bit more about GRAND campaign. It was the first time I heard of this, and I thought, wow, what an excellent initiative, and the Right to Food program that you were just mentioning, and some of your work in Sub-Saharan Africa. And thinking a little bit about, what role women play, in particularly around, peace and peace building, and their leadership in this. So I'd love to hear a little bit more from you, Peggy.
Wow, that's a big question. I just like to build a bit on what Natalia was saying. The climate crisis, climate change is at the hub of the food insecurity issue. And so GRAN is very active, working with partners that are working in that area, and trying to educate ourselves and know what we should be asking for, what we should be advocating for. The data is there. You look at South Africa, the southern part of Africa. This is the hardest hit area in the world in terms of food insecurity, and a lot of it related to climate change. It's a crisis in Nigeria, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, parts of Ethiopia, Kenya, and Somalia. So, there's no question that this is an area that really needs emphasis and priority and support. Beyond that, the grandmothers in Sub-Saharan Africa, they're telling us that food insecurity and problems with feeding their families is increasing dramatically. things like many of them are subsistent farmers. And so climate change is affecting that. The recent pandemic, the COVID pandemic has isolated them and they can't get their goods to market. The closure of schools has meant that the children that they care for and look after are missing sometimes the most important one substantial meal of the day. So the issue is urgent, and I'll talk more later about the things that we need to do. But Grand's campaign will certainly be urging the Canadian government and international forum like the UN and the World Health Organization to take some comprehensive action at this point.
Great, thank you, Peggy. And I think we will be putting some links in the chat about that program and others. So do have a look out for that. And now we'll go to Pilar. And if you could share, I know you introduced some of the programs that you've been working with Women United for Food and Environmental Security. It'd be great to hear a little bit more about this program and some of the challenges that women have been facing and how this program has been supporting women specifically.
Thank you, Crystal. And I do apologize for the background noise that you can hear. I'm in Lima. Lima is a very noisy city, so I hope you can hear me. Okay, and thank you, Peggy, because the issues that you mentioned are so common to Lima and to the women from the neighborhoods where MUSA project is implemented. So this project, Women United for Food, Environmental and Environmental Security, which has an acronym in Spanish that is MUSA, which translated is Muse, which is like somebody who inspires, is being implemented to respond to the food insecurity crisis in Peru caused by the pandemic. During the pandemic, women and their families in Peru, the pandemic was very strong and we were in a very strict lockdown. So women found themselves without food to feed their children, to feed their families. So these women organized themselves in marginalized urban and peri-urban neighborhoods in Lima during and after COVID-19 to provide a safe and healthy food for their families and also the community members, because many of them have lost their jobs or their family income generation activities. Currently, there are more than 2,500 community kitchens in Peru, but we work with just so many of them. So this project, MUSA, also supports urban agriculture. So women from the community kitchens work alongside urban gardeners that are women also in order to protect the environment using agroecological techniques instead of conventional agriculture. These urban gardeners are growing food, but also are training community kitchen women so they know how to grow their own food to be used in the community kitchens to feed the most vulnerable people. The project has a strong gender equality component because this project is being implemented in the outskirts of Lima in very underserved neighborhoods where sometimes gender-based violence is normalized when there are few services for women. So there is a training provided to these community kitchens and urban gardenings in order to prevent gender-based violence. But also they are trained in how to become empowered, and they are naturally empowered because they came together with this idea of forming the community kitchens. And also how to participate or be active in the decision-making process. They are also trained in entrepreneurial skills so they can transform the food that they produce, and the surplus can be sold or reach new markets. So their income in their families will increase. Adding value to the products. For example, they can produce jelly out of tomatoes, out of strawberries, or they can also produce infusions with aromatic plants, etc. The project also includes providing multi-purpose spaces that allow women, not only women, but also community members, to get together, to talk about their pressing issues, to make decisions, to bring petitions to the local governments, for example. So these spaces will be there in the community. Sometimes they serve as the community kitchen. They also serve as the place where kids go to do their homeworks, and also serve as a decision-making process room where they discuss the most pressing problems. This project was the idea of, the MUSA project was the idea of a platform that we call La Plataforma de Agricultura Urbana en Lima, or the Urban Agriculture Platform in Lima, that is formed by 6 organizations. One of them is CUSO International, and who leads the project. And also this project is implemented with funds from the Canada government, but also funds from private donors. And we still need those funds in order to complete, to finish the implementation of the project. In total, we plan to reach 1,250 women and their families that will be trained, that will be empowered, that will have different skills in order to thrive. We also are supporting 50 community kitchens out of those 2,500 that I mentioned, and we are supporting 20 association of urban gardeners. It's very interesting because these women train each other. We don't hire an expert or a university professor to train them. We train those women to become promoters who are able to train other women in gardening, in community kitchens. So it's very interesting, and it's great when they are able to express how this activity, how participating in this project has changed their lives, not only because they have a healthy meal, but because they have a network of women with whom they discuss things, with whom they talk about their problems. Another very interesting thing is that these women belong to different, they are diverse. They all have in common that they are poor, and I will talk about the challenges later. And the majority of them are adult women in their 50s, their 60s. So I follow Peggy when she says these women are the ones who are leading their families, and their families rely on them. But not only in food security, these women also have the burden of the care of the family, the care of the children, the grandchildren, the elderly, and they are the least. They are at the very bottom, right? So I would like to leave that idea. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Pilar. There's so many interconnecting commonalities I'm hearing from these different regions and experiences, and certainly the freedom and capacity for women to gather and mobilize and work together in spite of all of these challenges. Maybe I'll come back to Peggy, because I think there's some interesting links that I'd like to hear a little bit more about that intergenerational knowledge exchange and how important that is, particularly what do younger generations can learn? What's the opportunity there for younger generations to learn?
Well, let me say right off the top that older generations have a lot to learn from them. It's definitely a two-way street. And I really admire the leadership that young people are showing, around advocacy related to climate change and the issues associated with that. There's lots of good examples, both in Africa and here in Canada and other countries, where we see older people and younger people getting together to work on these issues. And I think, you know what, I think there's a real bond. You know, it was just such a joy to me. I went on a march on Parliament Hill, and I had with me there were 4 generations there. We were all together, and I learned so much from my grandchildren and from young people. So I think that this is really important, that we build this solidarity and that we work together. And as I mentioned, there are some organizations specifically around that. The other thing I wanted to just build on in the previous discussion is about the vulnerability issue of older people, particularly older women and gender diverse older women, older people. One of the reasons we're so focused on Sub-Saharan Africa and older women there, who are raising millions and millions of young people who are orphaned by AIDS, is that in addition to all of the vulnerabilities and risk factors that we know about and we talk about across the board, a big addition is the one around age. You know, in all societies, older women tend to be invisible. And certainly in data, they're not counted. We have virtually no data on older women and their health and quality of life in many African countries. This whole issue of age and making that one of the interconnections that we need to look at is really important. The other thing that the Africans and African grandmothers and older women are facing is, which is different, is that they're dealing with 2 pandemics. You know, we forget the HIV/AIDS pandemic is not over. People tend to think it is, but you know, in East and Southern Africa, 20 million people are living with HIV. And girls, young women are the most at risk for transmission because of increased gender-based violence, etc. But like we know that adolescent girls and young women are the most likely. In fact, the stat is that they're getting HIV every 2 minutes. So when you deal with that, and of course, if you've got HIV, good food is absolutely essential to surviving, in addition to the ART therapy. But the stigma attached to that, the stigma of being old, and many of these grandmothers are HIV positive themselves. Many of them are raising children who are HIV positive. So when you add those vulnerabilities to the scene, you can really see why this is a priority. This has to be a priority. But we'll talk more about this later. But I'd also like to acknowledge the leadership that older women are taking in terms of both agricultural techniques and in advocating for their rights for food security.
Great. Thank you so much, Peggy. I get to witness a lot of the intergenerational exchange here at the university as well. I'm learning so much all the time from my students, and it's not a huge gap, but it's still a big enough gap. There's you know, so much we can learn from each other. So I really appreciate that, and hope to, we can find more ways to exchange. I'd like to come back to Natalia, because I know you have a lot to share on these topics, and thinking about the ways in which women are you know, really supporting and mobilizing in your areas, and around particularly around aspects of conflict and their role as leaders in that area.
Yes, I think it's important to note how women's leadership has been crucial in the defense of land rights in the region. This is, as you know, closely tied to issues regarding food security and also climate change. And one of the current ongoing conflicts that we have in the region is that of indigenous communities' displacements due to extractive industries operations in the region. So we have this intersection of movements and organized communities that are fighting to stay in the land that has been indigenous land always, and also people who are protecting the environment and protecting the natural resources that these extractive industries are looking to exploit. So we have an intersection of these issues and a lot of women leading and protecting the land that they're on. And it is a very complex issue, as women are also the most vulnerable in these conflict situations. They're more vulnerable to gender-based violence in these disputed territories, and they're also more vulnerable to losing access to land, as women have the fewest land rights, the fewest land ownerships, and oftentimes the land that they reside in and the land that they perform agricultural activities on is usually not on their names and usually not secured in legal ways to them. So they're the most vulnerable to be losing access to land. And thus their voices in this conflict resolution talks and their voices in public policies regarding land ownership and the operation of extractive industries are absolutely crucial in order to be able to address these issues and these issues of inequality. So I think this, and I also want to emphasize a little bit, trailing off of that, how important it is that we address what is currently happening with international corporations and international companies exploiting the land in the global south, and how this has become, and usually these companies operate hand in hand with local and national governments, especially where governments are more corrupted, and how this really comes to affect women's rights issues and indigenous issues. So I think a lot has to be done also in that area, and also to address the public policies surrounding these topics.
Thank you, Natalia. And that kind of brings us to the next questions. I've been thinking of, so many challenges, but also lots of solutions from the ground up, from women really mobilizing, and these organizations that you're all working within. What are some of the, you mentioned policies and programs, and thinking of maybe some of the audience here from Canada as well. What should we know, or what can we do here to that? You mentioned multinational corporations, extractive resource extraction, the conflict and violence that is perpetuated because of that. What could we? What actions should we, and as in the global we, be able to do, or what should we avoid as we think about these communities, these women kind of on the front line? So I know that's a big question, and maybe that'll move us into a little bit of maybe some of the solutions or some of the ways forward, thinking hopefully in solidarity together. So maybe I'll come back to Pilar and Peggy and for maybe some final thoughts. We've got about 20 minutes left before we open it up to questions. So Pilar, if you have any thoughts on that.
Yes, definitely. I definitely agree with the challenges that Natalia has mentioned. As I said, there are many intersectionalities and commonalities with the situation in Peru. The territorial challenges, the extractivism activities, sometimes not being legal extractivism or fair extractivism activities for the indigenous people above all. So the challenges of poverty. I will talk about my project. All these women from Musa have various things in common. One of them is that they are poor. They live in very underserved areas of Lima. They came to Lima, to the capital city, looking for better opportunities for their families. Many of them came from the Andean region during the armed conflict in Peru, during Sendero Luminoso time, and they came escaping or fleeing from the conflict, as it is the case in many of the countries. You can see, I'm sure Natalia see these in Central America all the time, and Peggy also. I mean, migration and escaping from conflict is so common right now that is a huge challenge. So these people also are here, and they came from indigenous population. They didn't speak Spanish as the first language in many cases, and they suffer from racism, classism, and all those challenges. And on top of that, they are women and they suffer gender-based violence on top of all the challenges that they have to experience. So on top of that, they live on a desertic city. Lima is the second largest desertic city after Cairo, for example. So they don't have many things that they had in their homes when they live in the provinces. They don't have water, they don't have proper soil to grow vegetables. They don't have the basic conditions. And regarding to your question about what can we do as international organizations, I think we have the responsibility to be the voice of these women, of these people, and to talk about the challenges they face. You must be, I get very surprised when I came to Peru. I'm not Peruvian, I'm from Nicaragua, which is a very poor country as well, with many problems currently happening. I came to Peru with the idea that Peru was, in a better position than my country, than Central America, but there are huge gaps. There's a huge inequality in Lima itself. You live in one part of Lima, and then you move to where these women from the Musa project live, and it's like two separate worlds. So I think as organizations, we should continue not forgetting the women, their needs. I know there are many other issues going on, but women are there in every issue. Climate change affects women more than anybody. Food insecurity affects women because women always want to feed their families. Conflict, women are the ones who suffer conflict, who have to migrate with their families. If there's unemployment, women are the ones who also face the bigger challenges. So I would say that in Canada, for example, that is such a tremendous country, privileged, I have to say, compared to the Global South. I think organizations there have the power and also the means to support the efforts of development in the Global South, especially those initiatives that benefit women or that improve the lives of women and their children. And I want to tell you another common thing that women from the project that I work with have in common is that they still have dreams. Mm-hmm. Even if they are in their 50s, their 60s, they still dream for a better future, for their children. Some of them dream to finish education because they haven't had the opportunity to do it. And one little push will make a difference. So I would say continue supporting what needs to be supported. Thank you. So I leave the word to somebody else.
Thank you, Pilar. Peggy, maybe we'll go to you next.
Wow, well said. And again, many commonalities. Gran is working on this campaign, and we've developed our draft ideas of what we're going to do in terms of asking for action. And I'll just run through some of those at this time. First of all, to urge the government of Canada to increase its investments in international assistance to support resilient food systems in the global south, and especially in sub-Saharan Africa, where the need for food is most severe. This means a couple of things. It means a conscious effort, as was said, to advance gender equality and to leave no one behind, including older women and the children in their care. It means providing immediate support to enable small-scale food producers and very poor households to respond to the short-term needs to have food on the table, and build longer-term resilience to the threats that generated by climate change and economic insecurity. And perhaps mostly importantly, I think it means improving access to funding by the most vulnerable groups through programs that work with community partners and women-led organizations and integrate the principles of localization and decolonization. I'm here representing GRAN, but many of us are also members of the Grandmothers to Grandmothers campaign, which funds projects in sub-Saharan Africa with grandmothers through community partners, and encourage you to look at their website to see some examples of the kinds of things. But the important thing is to get the funds, to get the money to the people on the ground. Secondly, we need to urge the United Nations and other international forums, such as the World Health Organization, which I know well because I worked with them, to increase awareness of the right to food, who's most vulnerable, and call on member organizations and countries to address the issue. From GRAN's point of view, and I would hope from everyone's point of view, that we would stand in solidarity with the grandmothers, the older women in sub-Saharan Africa, who are showing leadership. They're both in terms of agricultural techniques and advocating with their governments. We need to work in partnership with other organizations, such as those on the call today, and to express the urgency of the action, of taking action. For example, GRAN is working with the Canadian Food Grains Bank and One Canada on a webinar tomorrow to produce a barrage of letters and phone calls now, before the 2023 federal budget is announced. I mentioned working together in intergenerational solidarity. And lastly, I would say, join us. You know, some 35 years ago, Gloria Steinem said, one day an army of gray-haired women may quietly take over the earth. So we're on the march now, and you'll see in the chat box how you can join us, GRAN, and look into the Stephen Lewis Grandmothers to Grandmothers campaign. You don't have to be a grandmother to join. We love grandothers. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Peggy. Those are really excellent points that we can all do to raise awareness, access funding, increase investment in these areas. I do have one question from the audience, actually, that is a good segue. So I'll just maybe follow up with Peggy on this one before I turn to Natalia. You mentioned, Peggy, that older women in the countries in Africa where you've been working have not been counted in research and stats, statistical gathering. Why do you think that is? And what are some of the factors that might lead them to not be included?
Yeah. Well, I think primarily it's a resource issue. You know, like we have Stats Canada. We have one of the best in the world at collecting information, but in many countries in Africa, they don't have the resources to do that. So they rely on their health statistics, their quality of life statistics, their household statistics through things like reproductive health clinics. So the older women are not there. You know, they don't have door-to-door surveys. And so they're not present. Like, you know, when a policymakers or a country head looks at the data, older people, older women just aren't there. So I think that Canada, with our experience and knowledge and resources, could help with that, definitely. That might be an area in your university that you might want to look into. But for the UN to recognize the importance of counting older people and help countries to do that is absolutely critical.
Thank you so much, Peggy. Maybe I'll turn to Natalia just for some final thoughts on that first question, that just on what you think others can do within your context. And I do see some questions coming in from the audience, which is wonderful. And then we'll turn to some of those questions. So Natalia, if you have any final thoughts on that last question there.
I think my colleagues here made great points that I just want to emphasize and add a little bit on. I think what people can do in countries in the global north can be very valuable to what's happening in the global south. For instance, regarding these extractive industries companies that create conflict over land and displaced communities and increase food insecurity. There are, I read a comment here that said that there are some Canadian companies doing this, and yes, exactly. I think Canadian citizens can also help advocate, or citizens in any other country that has one of these multinational companies can help advocate for better regulations around how these companies operate and promote accountability and in these organizations, and promote local policies in how these industries are operating in the global south, to have better practices, to be more responsible towards the human rights of indigenous communities, and how they can work alongside countries in the global south without engaging in these very damaging practices. So a lot can be done from advocating in the governments in the countries where these multinational industries are from. And as Peggy was saying, also promoting investment of governments towards countries in the programs that we have in supporting women's rights and food security and addressing climate change issues. So a lot of international aid and international cooperation comes into play into supporting communities in countries such as the countries in Central America can be supported as.
Thank you, Natalia. I'm just looking, we have a few questions here that are quite interesting. I think the first one is a nice for all the speakers here. Are there specific public policies in your country or region, or those of Canada's, that you are working with? I'd love to learn more about the public policy focus of your work. And I know that's come up a little bit actually in all three of your discussions on this, but maybe I'll kind of just open it up. If anyone, rather than kind of going one by one here, if anyone wants to speak to any specific policies, enabling policies that you think have been helpful. Peggy?
Well, two things come to mind. I'm sure there's many more, but Canada's foreign aid policy with international feminist policy, I think, is critical. And Gran likes this very much. And I think using the feminist lens and looking at international development is absolutely critical, and that's a bonus, certainly here in Canada. The other thing is a global movement. It was started by the World Health Organization. It's called age-friendly communities, age-friendly environments. And it is all over the world, and it's implemented at the local level. So in Canada, for example, there's over 300 age-friendly communities. And what they do is they talk with older people And then they look at 8 domains of what makes a community age friendly. So I think it's a global solid policy. It's a tool for looking at your community and how age friendly it is. And certainly food security is one of those factors. So those are 2 policies that come to mind.
Great, thanks, Peggy. Those are great, excellent examples. We could put some of those links in the chat too, if some of you are familiar with those policies that Peggy just mentioned, please do add them. Or if you do know of other policies that would be relevant to this conversation, please do add in the chat. Pilar, did you want to?
Yes, yeah, I would like to second Peggy about, regarding the international assistance policy, feminist international assistance policy of Canada. And this is, I think it is really, Canada is a pioneer, I think, by calling the international assistance policy the name feminist. And because that word, especially in these countries of the global South, sometimes it's satanized or taken in a negative term. But I think that by saying that Canada will support all the programs that put the women and girls at the center, it is a great thing. And we in QSO, we are lucky to be implementing the Women's Voice and Leadership project. That is, I think, an important project that came from that international assistance policy. We are also implementing that in Peru, and we are supporting women from different backgrounds. We are supporting feminist and local organizations, including one organization that is the National Indigenous Organization of Andean and Amazonian Women. So that policy is key for us. And, it allows us to also create new policies in the countries where we work. As part of the Women's Voice and Leadership Project, for example, we have been able to push some important bills in Peru that assure alternation and parity when it comes to running for public offices. I mean, it means that equal number of women and men must be candidates. And so that is great. And in terms of MUSA, the women are also advocating for policies that protect their urban agriculture activities, and they are fighting for the local government to recognize and to support urban agriculture, and also to support, they have also worked so the policy that supports the community kitchens has been approved. The bill has been approved. So women also make a lot of advocacy, and they are more prone, I would say, to do advocacy in benefit of their communities and their families. So they would do whatever it takes to push for beneficial policy making.
Thank you, Pilar. And Natalia, if you wanted to anything to add to that particular conversation, I just want to make just a statement that I'm seeing some great questions coming in. So I just want to let those of you joining that if you do want to continue asking questions, I'll try to integrate them into the discussion, into our questions as well. We're going to just have the Q&A kind of starting now. So as questions come in, I'll try and do my best to bring them into the conversation. So Natalia, if there's anything particularly around the kind of policies and programs that you're seeing.
There are different types of policies and approaches that can support women access food security and land ownership, but there's a particular example that we're currently working on, and that is on the policy in just to be a very specific example, the policy in Honduras regarding credit access for women. And this type of policies support women in having the resources needed in order to create their own forms of sustenance and to participate in commercial activities, helping women break that initial barrier of having enough resources to start working the land or working in their own entrepreneurships. So these are some of the policies that can help break those initial barriers, and that we are supporting local organizations in building upon this policy. I saw a very interesting question in the Q&A that is a bit related to policies. I don't know if I can answer it or if
Please,
yes.
go ahead. Yeah.
I saw this question regarding how the intersections of queerness and transness show up in this work. And before we move on from the topic of policies, I think there's a very important barrier for women to access certain policies because they're invisible in these policies, but even more so for queer, gender diverse, or trans people. So oftentimes there is a lack of programs in general that help these different identities access resources or protections or support in order to overcome barriers in food security. But it is not only is it hard for these policies to exist, but once they exist, they usually leave behind these identities. They're particularly for queer, trans, non-binary people. They're not recognized by the law. Their identities are not recognized by the law, and this creates a lot of different. Of course, I'm talking about the Central America region. In some countries, I know it's different, but this creates important barriers for people to be able to access government-led programs, as they are completely invisible, and if they are visible, they're subjected to violence and systemic violence, and this creates. If there are already barriers existing to access food security programs, this creates an additional layer of barriers for queer people. So in general, this is regarding policies, but in overall how these issues particularly impact queer people, it means that if there are already intersecting issues that create inequality, this is another issue that adds on to this and further pushes people away from access to resources and to be able to fulfill their human rights. And usually this is related to systemic exclusion from social programs, government programs, but also systemic exclusion from their own communities, making them more prone to displacement and to migration and to lack of access to land. So, yeah.
Thank you, Natalia. I can see Peggy nodding there, so please jump in.
Oh, just to say thank you, and I acknowledge everything that you just said. Certainly with the older women, grandmothers, and the communities in Sub-Saharan Africa, gender diversity is a huge issue, and as you say, a major barrier to equality and accessing programs and activities and things that food that people need. In some countries in Africa, being a homosexual, having that identity, you're subject to jail. That's, still the reality. So this is a huge area that, and Gran works hard. Sometimes it's difficult, what do you say? Older women, gender diverse older women, but recognizing the interconnection and the importance of gender diversity is critical. Thank you.
Your mic is off.
Of course, I had to try it at least once during. Oh, thanks, Peggy. I'm just looking at the time, and I think we'll take one last question, and then I'll just invite our speakers to say just a few final words, if anything that you haven't had a chance to share that you wanted to share today. But I'm just seeing the one question here. It's for Natalia, and it's building off some of your previous points, but maybe there's something that you'd like to add, your experience working in Central. How are women's social movements and groups working together towards complementary goals? And then speaking about gender diversity and LGBTQ advocacy, which you spoke to as well. So just if you wanted to add anything to that final question, and then I think I'll invite you all to say a few words to finalize.
I'll try to be very brief. So we have been speaking this time a lot of the intersections of inequality, and a lot of these intersecting issues of inequality usually have very similar root causes. So we're talking about patriarchal systems, neocolonialism, these systemic structures. So a lot of women's rights movements and women's rights organizations end up working together because they're addressing very similar goals, in the sense of trying to dismantle the systemic issues that are currently affecting in these things that trail from these issues, such as food insecurity, gender-based violence, access to land. They all have very similar root causes. So in essence, these movements work together in addressing these root causes in different levels. And this is how it comes to intersect. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Natalia. I think now we'll just maybe pivot to any closing remarks. I know we've shared a lot of really critical, important pieces from each of your experiences, and I'm seeing so many similarities across globally from all of your work. If there's anything you haven't had a chance to share, or if something's come up maybe from one of the other panelists that you wanted to mention or think about further, then I guess this is our time. So I'll just open it up for any final remarks. Maybe Peggy, I'll start with you if that's okay.
Thank you. I just wanted to point out in the chat box that Phyllis Webster, who's on the call and is an active member of GRAN, has given you some information about the mining justice group that is part of our campaign as well. So you can look into that. I guess I just want to say three things. First of all, thank you so much for allowing me to be part of this. Secondly, to set the interconnection between human rights and women's rights. And the right to food security, which is our current campaign, it interacts and intersects with the right to health, the right to security, the right to nonviolence, the right to gender equality. And using that human rights approach, I think, is the way to go. And then lastly, as I said earlier, please join us, because together we're going to be stronger.
Thank you so much, Peggy, for those wise words. Maybe Pilar, I'll pass it along to you.
Thank you. I'm also honored to have been part of this conversation, I would say, with 2-3 very interesting women. I would say mine will be words for a call of, to take action. Sometimes we get overwhelmed. I'm from the global South. I know how it is to think, where should I start from, right? I know how it is to be easy to be hopeless, but it is also very important that we continue to be hopeful and that we continue doing our best from our own fronts to support these kind of initiatives that make the lives of women, better. And so in any way you can, if you are in the global north, you can support with funding, you know, the programs that you feel more attracted to. If you are in the south, or if you are like me, you know, get to work in you know, with the communities. I love to work with the communities and listen to them and bring their voices to the global north. Do this so other people can hear them through us. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Pilar. Natalia.
Thank you. I'm also very grateful to have been able to be part of this conversation, and I'm very inspired by listening to the work that Pilar and Peggy are doing and the organizations are doing, and very thankful for you, Crystal, to catalyze this amazing conversation and learning a lot from you all. As a final message, I would like to bring forward something that was all along our conversation, which is the transformative power of working with a gender-based approach, or the transformative power of women's rights movements, and how these are not only transforming the very own issue of women's rights, but also transforming more systemic issues that affect everyone. So the importance of supporting women's rights movements, feminist movements, and people working for gender justice, as these are game changers for the realities of communities suffering inequality in all over the world. And besides that, also emphasizing something my colleagues already mentioned, but also the importance of listening to those people leading these movements and listening to their voices, their demands, and uplifting these voices where we can, and supporting the people that are in the front lines of land defense, the defense of the environment, and women's rights issues.
Thank you, Natalia. Well, thank you all so much for these very strong and hopeful final remarks. I've certainly been very inspired, and it's been wonderful to learn what you're doing individually and what your organizations are doing, and certainly giving that platform, as you're saying, it's so critical. Yeah, it's been a real pleasure for me to host this. So I think Anne-Catherine and Brianne as well. I see Anne-Catherine's jumped on here, so I think I'll pass it over to Anne-Catherine for some final remarks. But thank you all so much for joining today.
Hi. There's a little bit of a kind of an honor that one doesn't, you know, the thing about being the one to welcome and then the one to say goodbye. It's as if we had this privilege and then we do nothing, right? What I found, so I get to speak what I want to. What I found and what I find again and again today is that I keep wanting to change the word international, because even just now hearing you, I was thinking this is not about intergenerational or international or global south and global north. It's not about binaries. It's not about people speaking with each other, but rather people speaking across and beyond the age, beyond the nation, beyond, and really getting to the crux of the issues that we have to deal with. So I just found it fabulous, and actually went to look at the Latin roots of the words, and trans is a Latin noun or prefix meaning across or beyond. Inter means between, among, or within a group. So I really am pushing, I mean, at work, we've been talking a lot about translocality, that we want to stop people thinking that international is some other in the global south or some other who is poorer. And instead we talk about translocality, that it's a locality in, I don't know if Spuzum still exists in BC, but Spuzum and Patacamaya in Bolivia, the knowledge that can be had amongst them, or the knowledge that can be had amongst generations. I've had a chance to hear a lot more from Gran, for example, and I don't see it, well, I would hate to see it as old and then our climate change branch is young. The thing is that we have people who have been activists for more decades. But again, it's not because they're elders that we put up there and then youth that need to be, you know, we just need to mix up those categories a lot more and speak trans-border, trans-generation, trans everything. So yeah, I was only supposed to thank you, especially thanking, well, each of you. I was going to say especially Crystal, then I could say especially Brianne, who's organized all of this, Laurel and Mary, who've been supporting without being seen. But many, many thanks for Natalia, Pilar, and Peggy, also on different time zones. So I don't know how you're doing, but thank you very, very much. And the participants, your questions were fabulous as well. It's been quite a turnout. We're very, I was going to say emocionada, very moved by this panel. I will now pass it over to Brianne, who has a few words to say about our next events, I believe.
Thank you. I was actually not prepared to share that, but I'm happy to. Thanks for the mic, Ankat. Thank you everybody so much for joining. As Ankat mentioned at the beginning of this event today, it is International Development Week across Canada. And so BCCIC, our partners and members, whom are BC-based international development organizations, are hosting a range of events and digital initiatives this week that you are invited to check out. BCCIC has an event on Thursday called Inside Out, Guarding Indigenous People's Rights in Tanzania, which will feature 2 Indigenous rights activists from Maasai land, and it's going to be a really great event, as well as a couple of digital initiatives taking place this week. So I'll link that out, further information about that in the comment box below, but we'll also be sharing a link to our events calendar on our website, so you can see the range of events taking place across Canada. But lovely to have this discussion with everybody, and we will be following up with attendees and registrants tomorrow. If you have any questions that you didn't get to ask today, please feel free to send them along to me. I'll write my email in this inbox, and then I can forward them to all of our speakers who have offered to answer any questions that you might have as the audience. So yes, thank you everybody so much.
And since I put Brianne on the spot, I'll put Crystal on the spot as well, because you mentioned CIFAL UNITAR. Maybe a few words about who CIFAL is and what participants might want to know about reaching out to CIFAL. What for? Why?
Yeah, thanks, Ankat. I've just pulled up our website here so I can put it in the chat. So CIFAL Victoria, let me just get the link here, is one of, I think there's 29 centers around the world, CIFAL centers. When we launched last March, so it's almost been a year now, at the University of Victoria, and here we go. Oh, I sent it to Brianne. Let me send it there one more time. So these are kind of the training arms of what they're calling for UNITAR, United Nations Institute for Training and Research, with the goal is to build capacity through research and training. So we are creating and also promoting courses and training opportunities. There are UN certified, so we go through a certification process. We just launched our first course actually in the fall in Tanzania, working with local government leaders and researchers doing leadership in community-based research to address climate action. So that was one of our first courses. We're developing new certificate courses and short workshops, and you know, promoting other community partners and other initiatives, both on campus but within Canada and globally as well. So we're connected to the global network, and I'd be happy to answer any more questions. That was a short elevator pitch there. But thank you, and we're very, very pleased to partner with you on this.
Thank you very much, everybody, all the participants and the panelists and organizers. Thank you.
Thank you.